Slow down for a second, because the truth about your idols is darker than any thriller. You've seen them in tuxedos on red carpets, but in reality, these 10 Hollywood icons felt most at home in jail cells and interrogation rooms. One of them, a cult noir star, turned into a raging animal once the cameras stopped rolling, shot his own nephew, and lunged at colleagues with a knife even in his 70s. He didn't play psychopaths, he was one, and even the great Quentin Tarantino was afraid to be in the same room with him. Like this video, subscribe so you don't miss this investigation, and tell us in the comments whether you knew your favorite actors were real-life cutthroats. The truth will shock you.
Frank Sinatra. When we hear the velvet voice of Frank Sinatra, we picture the flawless gentleman in a tuxedo, a conqueror of women's hearts and a symbol of the American dream. Yet behind that immaculate facade lay a reality so troubling that the FBI compiled a 2,400-page file on him. Sinatra didn't just know the underworld, he was born into its orbit. His roots led back to Hoboken, New Jersey, a city steeped in crime in the early 20th century. It was the birthplace not only of great singers, but also of Lucky Luciano, the mastermind of the American Mafia. The Sinatra household lived by the rules of the street. His father, Marty, was more than a firefighter. He later admitted to involvement in bootlegging during Prohibition. From childhood, little Frank watched his father guard trucks loaded with illegal liquor, protecting the syndicate's interests from hijackers. That world shaped him. Beneath the polish and charm was a hard man who understood loyalty and danger. Many wondered how a young singer rose so quickly to the top, breaking his restrictive contract with famed trombonist Tommy Dorsey. The official story spoke of legal maneuvering, but the truth whispered backstage was far darker. According to legend, gangster Willie Moretti paid Dorsey a personal visit and, casually playing with a gun, persuaded him to release Sinatra for $1. The episode became Hollywood lore, later immortalized in The Godfather through the character of Johnny Fontaine. Sinatra became a singular figure in American history, a living bridge between the political elite and organized crime. He maintained close ties with Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli, the mafia's so-called diplomat in Hollywood. These men were not merely friends, they were investors in his career, expecting him to serve as their voice in the corridors of power. His connections reached their peak during John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. Through Sinatra, Giancana lent support to Kennedy, hoping the new administration would ease pressure on organized crime. But what followed was a brutal disappointment. When Robert Kennedy, appointed Attorney General, warned his brother about the danger of associating with a mob-connected singer, the president swiftly distanced himself. Sinatra's fury was volcanic. At his Palm Springs estate, he personally took a sledgehammer to the helipad he had built specifically for Kennedy's visit. It wasn't merely a personal slight, it was the collapse of an illusion that he could stand shoulder to shoulder with kings and presidents. Yet, despite the rupture, his influence in Hollywood remained intact, bolstered by shadowy patrons. His Oscar-winning role in From Here to Eternity, which rescued his faltering career, reportedly came with the help of capo Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo. The gangster allegedly reminded Columbia Pictures chief Harry Cohn of certain debts owed to the syndicate, and the casting issue was resolved overnight. Until the end of his life, Sinatra remained under the watchful eye of federal authorities. The FBI viewed him not as a naive bystander, but as an active participant, a courier and liaison for the mafia syndicate. He was frequently seen alongside some of America's most wanted men, flying with them to Cuba and Las Vegas, carrying envelopes and passing messages too sensitive to trust to a telephone line. Though he was never formally charged with serious crimes, his reputation remained inseparable from omertà, the code of silence. He embodied a dangerous charm, a man whose voice could make the world weep, while his connections made it tremble. Sinatra proved that in classic Hollywood, the line between star and criminal was so thin it could vanish even under the FBI's microscope.
Lawrence Tierney. Lawrence Tierney did not merely play criminals on screen. He was a frightening force of nature whose life beyond the set read like an endless police blotter. While other actors crafted their tough guy personas with makeup and carefully written scripts, Tierney lived in a state of permanent war with society, the law, and common sense itself. His breakthrough came in 1945 when he portrayed the legendary bank robber John Dillinger. The role proved to be more than a professional triumph. It was a curse, perhaps even a prophecy. For the rest of his career, Tierney seemed to mirror the destructive behavior of his on-screen alter ego, turning his own biography into a running crime report. Between 1944 and 1951, his life descended into near total chaos. In those few short years alone, he was arrested at least 12 times on charges ranging from drunken brawling and unprovoked assaults on civilians to violent clashes with police officers. His name surfaced regularly in newspapers, not in the society pages, but in columns detailing incidents of senseless brutality and bizarre misconduct. The list of his exploits was as varied as it was absurd. In fits of uncontrolled rage, he would rip payphones from the walls of bars, attack waiters with heavy sugar bowls as improvised weapons, or attempt to strangle a taxi driver while the cab was still speeding through traffic. In 1947 and again in 1949, he served real jail time for participating in mass street fights. In 1951, he was sentenced to 3 months in a New York prison for breaking the jaw of a college student during a barroom altercation. Even while starring in acknowledged noir masterpieces such as Born to Kill, critics remarked on what they called his theatrical nastiness, though Tierney himself paradoxically insisted that he despised violence and loathed the brutal characters he portrayed. The facts suggested otherwise. His fury never truly left him. It aged with him, hardening into something even more volatile, the menace of an old man who had never learned restraint. A particularly bloody episode unfolded in 1991 during the filming of the cult classic Reservoir Dogs. Deeply intoxicated, Tierney was arrested after shooting his own nephew. Director Quentin Tarantino, who had already struggled with the actor's temperament on set, openly referred to him as a complete lunatic, nearly impossible to manage without medication. Eventually, Tarantino dismissed him after yet another fight, deciding that no amount of talent justified the risk he posed to the cast and crew. Tierney's instability revealed itself even in smaller incidents. During the filming of the popular sitcom Seinfeld, he was caught stealing a knife from the props department. Confronted with the theft, he responded not with apology, but by reenacting the infamous murder scene from Psycho, terrifying the crew and his fellow actors nearly out of their wits. Even at 75, when most men seek peace and quiet, Lawrence Tierney continued to be the toughest guy in the holding cell, once again released on bail after another brush with the law. He lived as though the line between crime film and reality had been permanently erased, leaving behind a trail of broken teeth, lawsuits, and roles for which he never had to pretend.
Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum had that heavy, half-lidded gaze of a man who had seen too much grime in this life to feign awe and Hollywood's glitter. It wasn't a carefully crafted technique or some devotion to Stanislavski's method. It was the scorched fatigue of someone who had already scraped the bottom of America long before he came of age. Mitchum didn't play cynics. He was one. In the depths of the Great Depression, when America felt like a sprawling camp of the homeless and the hopeless, 16-year-old Robert had already tasted prison stew and felt the bite of shackles on his wrists. His road began not on a stage, but on the dusty highways of Georgia. where he was arrested for vagrancy and sentenced to hard labor. Mitchum became part of a chain gang, those infamous crews of convicts bound together by iron links. Under the brutal southern sun, he learned when to keep silent under a guard's shout and when to strike first in the stillness that followed. His escape from the chain gang was his first real action sequence. He hid in swamps, slipped through forests, and emerged a professional drifter, a hobo riding the roofs of freight trains. The broken nose that later became his trademark wasn't the result of a stunt gone wrong. It was a souvenir from bare-knuckle fights for food and savage clashes with railroad bulls. When Mitchum finally landed in Hollywood, the industry tried to wrap him in the costume of a leading man, but the rebel inside him kept breaking through. He despised the acting world, dismissing his profession as grown-ups playing dress-up, and he never concealed his taste for forbidden pleasures. In 1948, at the height of his fame, a scandal erupted that should have destroyed him. Mitchum was arrested during a police raid on a Laurel Canyon party. Marijuana was found on him, and in those days, that stain was nearly a civic death sentence. Executives at RKO panicked, bracing for boycotts and ruin. Sitting in the police station, Mitchum reportedly told the detectives with a shrug, "Well, that's the bitter end of it. My career, my marriage, my future." But instead of writhing, lying, or assembling a battalion of lawyers to paint himself as a victim, he showed the stoic bluntness audiences instinctively trusted. He pled guilty and served 60 days on a Los Angeles County prison farm. Even his incarceration turned into a surreal spectacle. Tabloid photographers camped outside the fences, desperate for a shot of the star in prison denim pushing a mop across the floor. Mitchum never hid his face and never demanded special treatment. When he walked free, Hollywood discovered something astonishing. His popularity hadn't dipped, it had exploded. A public weary of polished artificial idols saw in him one of their own, a man who had stumbled, paid his time, and refused to whine about it. He became America's first official bad boy, a star whose criminal record did more for his image than any publicity machine could have dreamed. On set, directors feared him and revered him in equal measure. He might arrive smelling of last night's whiskey, mutter his lines in a single take with such quiet brilliance that the crew felt a chill, and then, if a stuntman grew too cocky, settled the matter with one clean punch. His creed was detachment. He never watched his own films and never read reviews, claiming he had more important things to do, like making it to tomorrow. That distance was a shield. Mitchum knew that behind every painted backdrop stood the real world, a world of chain gangs, hunger, and iron links, and that it never truly releases the children it once claimed.
George Raft was a singular phenomenon in the history of cinema. He did not simply portray gangsters. He served as their unofficial ambassador beneath the Klieg lights and along the red carpets. While other actors spent months studying the mannerisms of the underworld, Raft needed only to remember his childhood in Hell's Kitchen, then the roughest quarter of New York. His life story was braided tightly with the rise of the American crime syndicate. As a teenager, he did not dream of the stage. His companions were men like Bugsy Siegel and Audie Murphy, future architects of organized crime in the United States. To Raft, mob bosses were not headlines in the morning paper. They were neighborhood boys with whom he had shared his last crust of bread and traded blows in street fights. When Bugsy Siegel, one of the mafia's most charismatic and dangerous killers, arrived in Los Angeles to seize control of labor unions and lay the foundation for a gambling empire, it was George Raft who became his guide, his bridge into Hollywood society, and his most visible shield among the elite. Raft's ties to the underworld were no whispered rumor. He wore them openly, almost proudly. He used his status as a film star as legitimate cover for syndicate business.
He regularly accompanied Siegel to meetings with film industry unions, where Raft's mere presence, that narrowed gaze, that reputation for having a direct line to East Coast bosses, proved more persuasive than any spoken threat. When the mob violently crushed a major Hollywood strike in 1934, Raft did little to disguise his satisfaction. He strolled through the Paramount studio lots with a victor's smile, fully aware that behind him stood the invisible yet lethal soldiers of Frank Nitti. His loyalty to the family bordered on the absurd. He refused roles that portrayed criminals in an unfavorable light. Guided by his peculiar code of honor, he turned down parts in Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon, roles that would later cement Humphrey Bogart's legend. Believing that allowing his character to be killed by police or defeated by the law was a personal insult to his real-life friends. But such devotion carried a bloody price. The collapse of his career and personal life began in June 1947, when Benny Siegel was gunned down in the Beverly Hills home of his lover, Virginia Hill. For Raft, it was more than the loss of a friend. It marked the end of his own legitimacy in Hollywood. He publicly declared a sentence that echoed through studio offices across the city. "When they killed Benny, they killed me too." After Siegel's death, Raft found himself isolated. Studio executives who had once courted him out of fear of mob retaliation now saw only a liability trailing blood and federal investigations. Leading roles vanished, contracts were quietly terminated, the income tax service began its methodical pursuit of his once extravagant earnings. From a marquee idol, he became a pariah, a man whose telephone stopped ringing for good. The final act of George Raft's life carried a bitter irony. Ruined by lawsuits and by his own taste for lavish living, he accepted an offer from Meyer Lansky, the mob's financial mastermind. The former idol of millions ended his days in Las Vegas and in Cuba, working as a casino greeter, a living relic. He was paid simply to stand in the lobby in his immaculate 1930 suit, allowing tourists to brush shoulders with the legend of a real gangster. He drew crowds with the aura of crime, though he was by then only a shadow of the man who had once dictated terms to major studios. Even in old age, he retained the habit of flipping a coin, a gesture he had invented for his character in Scarface, but which in real life became the emblem of his fate, a gambler who put everything on black and in the end was left with nothing.
Roman Polanski. The story of Roman Polanski is more than the biography of a renowned director. It unfolds like a complex psychological drama in which the boundary between artistic brilliance and personal downfall blurred on a decisive night in 1977. His path to becoming a controversial international figure was marked by tragedies that might have shattered anyone else. Survival in the Polish ghetto during the Holocaust, the loss of his mother in a concentration camp, and the brutal murder of his wife in his own home by followers of Charles Manson. One might assume that a man who endured such devastation would be forever guarded against darkness. Instead, the permissive, excess-driven atmosphere of 1970s Hollywood became another turning point in his life. In 1977, at the height of his acclaim following the success of Chinatown, Polanski was arrested at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. The charges deeply shocked Los Angeles: unlawful sexual conduct involving 13-year-old Samantha Gailey, with allegations that alcohol and drugs had been used during the encounter. What began as a photo session became a legal case that permanently divided his life into before and after.
The legal proceedings that followed resembled an intricate chess match between defense and prosecution. In an effort to avoid a potentially severe sentence, Polanski agreed to a plea deal, admitting guilt to a reduced charge of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. However, uncertainty arose when Judge Lawrence Rittenband indicated he might reconsider the agreed recommendation and impose a much harsher sentence, reportedly to set a public example. Fearing an outcome he believed would be extreme, Polanski made the decision that defined the rest of his life. In 1978, shortly before sentencing, he left the United States for London and then settled in Paris, relying on his French citizenship. From that moment, his career continued alongside a long period of exile as he remained outside the reach of American courts. Living abroad placed lasting constraints on both his movements and reputation. Subject to an Interpol notice, travel beyond certain European countries carried the risk of detention. For decades, the United States sought his return, and each award or public appearance occasionally reignited political and legal debate. The situation escalated again in 2009 when Polanski traveled to Switzerland to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award. Upon arrival at Zurich Airport, he was detained at the request of U.S. authorities and later placed under house arrest in his mountain residence. The event sparked division internationally. Some called for extradition, others urged consideration of the time that had passed and the legal complexities involved. Ultimately, Swiss authorities declined the extradition request, and Polanski returned to France, though the legal controversy remained unresolved. A defining element of Polanski's public stance has been his consistent view of himself as someone treated unfairly by the judicial process and media narrative. He has at times compared his situation to historic cases of disputed justice, while critics strongly reject such parallels. In recent years, additional women have publicly shared accusations dating back to the 1970s, further intensifying debate around his legacy. Hollywood, which once celebrated him, eventually distanced itself. Polanski was expelled from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and his name became closely associated with ongoing controversy. Today, he lives relatively privately in Europe, a filmmaker whose work explored themes of fear, isolation, and moral ambiguity, while his own life continues to prompt complex and often painful discussions. His story serves as a reminder that artistic achievement and personal conduct are judged on different scales, and that even the most celebrated figures remain subject to the enduring scrutiny of history.
Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr entered Hollywood history as a woman of otherworldly beauty, her profile hailed as the very standard of perfection, her intellect years ahead of its time. Yet in 1966, the world glimpsed another side of the woman once dubbed the most beautiful in the world, a side marked by loneliness, desperation, and baffling acts that seemed to defy explanation. Lamarr was celebrated not only for her film roles, but also for co-inventing a communication system that would later underpin Wi-Fi technology. Even so, her personal life and finances were unraveling. A scandal erupted in Los Angeles when the former screen goddess was detained at the prestigious department store Mayco Wilshire. Store security accused her of shoplifting, a humiliating charge utterly at odds with her image as a Hollywood diva. The total value of the items was almost absurd for a star of her stature, approximately $86. The list included souvenir postcards, cosmetics, and a bikini. The incident splashed across front pages nationwide, becoming a public spectacle in which the glamour of old Hollywood collided with the harsh reality of arrest, fingerprinting, and a $550 bail. Her trial quickly turned into a national drama. Ira Reiner, eager to build his reputation on a celebrity case, described her actions as systematic and deliberate. He argued that Lamarr had not simply forgotten to pay, but had intentionally concealed the merchandise in an effort to deceive store employees. The defense adopted an aggressive strategy, accusing Mayco's security staff of employing Gestapo tactics and mistreating a woman who had brought such a claim to the country. Hedy herself appeared in court diminished and visibly aged. The confidence that had once defined her seemed to dissolve beneath the relentless flashes of reporters' cameras, all hungry to capture the fall of a legend. Though the jury ultimately acquitted her, the damage to her reputation was irreversible. In Hollywood, a town notoriously unforgiving to aging actresses, the scandal served as a clear signal that Lamarr was no longer a safe investment. Studios quietly closed their doors, wary of what they perceived as increasingly unpredictable behavior from a woman whose mental state was becoming the subject of whispered concern. The Mayco episode soon found a strange and ironic afterlife in the art world. Only months after the trial, the legendary pop artist Andy Warhol, fascinated by the themes of fading fame and public disgrace, produced an underground film titled Hedy. The work offered a satirical, grotesque reimagining of the shoplifting incident. In it, the drag performer Mario Montez exaggerated Hedy's gestures and expressions, mocking her attempts to preserve dignity amid total collapse. For the public and the bohemian avant-garde alike, the affair became a living symbol of how swiftly fame can turn on itself. A minor theft in a department store dismantled the image of a screen goddess more efficiently than a string of box office failures ever could. Lamarr, who had fought all her life to be taken seriously, not merely as a beautiful face, but as a serious inventor, found herself trapped in the caricature of a deranged kleptomaniac. The label wounded her deeply and drove her further into seclusion. The incident marked only the beginning of a long, sorrowful decline. In 1991, history repeated itself. Lamarr was arrested again for shoplifting, this time in a pharmacy in Florida for merchandise worth $21. These repeated petty crimes pointed to profound psychological struggles, perhaps rooted in chronic depression and a growing sense of irrelevance. The woman whose patent for frequency hopping technology had been seized by the U.S. government during the war and used without compensation lived on a modest pension while her invention quietly began to transform the modern world. She faded into obscurity and poverty, communicating with the outside world almost exclusively by telephone, reluctant to be seen after a series of unsuccessful cosmetic surgeries left her disfigured in her own eyes. Hedy Lamarr's story stands as a cautionary tale about how readily society can trample its idols over a single misstep, forgetting the immense contributions they have made. She was too intelligent for Hollywood and too beautiful for science, and that fracture between mind and image, achievement and illusion, ultimately led her to the threshold of Mayco, a point from which there was no return.
James Cagney, who became for millions the embodiment of the explosive, dangerous, unshakable criminal, never regarded his performances as pure acting. To him, the violence on screen felt like a natural extension of a life forged in one of New York's roughest neighborhoods, Hell's Kitchen. While other future stars polished their diction and posture, Cagney sharpened his instincts in street fights where defeat meant far more than a bad review. At just 5'5", he compensated for his size with lightning speed, compact strength, and a refusal to back down. He learned early how to hold his ground against men bigger and heavier than himself. When he first appeared on screen, audiences were stunned by the raw force of his movements. His punches looked startlingly real because they were rooted in hard experience, delivered with a precision shaped by years of surviving on unforgiving streets. The secret of Cagney's intensity lay in observation. He drew less from theatrical tradition than from the people he had known growing up, men who lived on the edge of the law. His celebrated performance in Angels with Dirty Faces carried small, unforgettable gestures, a nervous tilt of the neck, a sharp adjustment of his trousers with his elbows. These details were not inventions of a screenwriter. Cagney had borrowed them from a troubled figure he remembered from his youth, studying the habits and body language of men whose lives moved in darker directions. His early environment left a lasting impression. Among the boys he once knew was Peter Buddha Hesse, who later gained notoriety in the city and eventually faced execution at Sing Sing. Cagney never denied that he had grown up alongside people who followed that path. Instead, he channeled the emotional truth of those memories into his roles, bringing a layer of authenticity to Hollywood's portrayals of crime. On set, Cagney carried the same intensity he had developed in his youth. He demanded professionalism and discipline, especially from younger performers who mistook fame for license. During one production, a group of teenage actors known as the Dead End Kids tested his patience by disrupting scenes with ill-timed improvisation. Cagney did not complain to producers or stage a dramatic confrontation. Instead, he addressed the problem directly and firmly, making it clear that respect and focus were not optional. The message was unmistakable. On his set, work came first. His commitment to realism sometimes pushed boundaries. In an era before sophisticated special effects, action scenes relied heavily on practical methods. Cagney believed that genuine tension on screen required actors to feel real risk, and he was known for insisting on authenticity in staging gunfire and physical confrontations. During the filming of The Public Enemy, a near miss involving debris from a gunshot left a lasting impression on the crew. Even incidents like that did little to change his approach. Cagney seemed most at ease portraying men who walked a razor's edge between ambition and destruction. He did not romanticize criminals, but he understood them from the inside out. In many ways, he remained the boy from Hell's Kitchen who had traded street corners for studio lights, carrying with him a quiet intensity, a survivor's instincts, and a presence that made every gangster he played feel unsettlingly alive.
Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy entered Hollywood history as an anomaly, living proof that reality can surpass even the most extravagant screenplay. He was not an actor who learned to wear a military uniform. He was the man who made that uniform legendary, becoming the most decorated American soldier of the Second World War. His record read like the fevered dream of an overzealous propagandist. By the age of 19, this slight, almost fragile-looking boy from Texas had personally killed more than 240 enemy soldiers, held off entire tank units alone, and received every major decoration for valor, including the Medal of Honor. When Murphy arrived in Hollywood, producers faced a peculiar problem. The truth of his exploits was so extreme that audiences would have dismissed it as fantasy. In the autobiographical film To Hell and Back, many of his real combat episodes had to be deliberately toned down, trimmed and softened, so the story would not seem like an implausible action spectacle. Yet behind the facade of the national hero stood a man whose soul had been scorched hollow by war, and whose film career became less a triumph than a desperate attempt to silence the screams of fallen comrades. To Hollywood, Murphy was the perfect golden boy, a youthful face paired with a steel-cold gaze. Off-camera, however, his daily life resembled a prolonged nightmare. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress at a time when the diagnosis did not officially exist, and veterans were told simply to pull themselves together. His mind remained locked in combat mode, primed for immediate annihilation of any perceived threat, a switch that never fully turned off. According to his first wife, actress Wanda Hendricks, living with Audie was like inhabiting a minefield. He slept only with a loaded pistol beneath his pillow, ready at any second to fire at an invisible enemy. Brutal flashbacks stalked him. During these episodes, he would lose contact with reality entirely. His face hardened, his eyes emptied of warmth and filled with something lethal. In those moments, he became once again the war machine who had single-handedly mown down enemy troops in the Colmar pocket. On one occasion, during an argument with a businessman, Murphy transformed so swiftly and so menacingly that his opponent physically recoiled. It was as if the man across from him suddenly understood that he was facing someone for whom human life carried no abstract weight, someone capable of killing without hesitation and without remorse. On the sets of the westerns in which Murphy most frequently appeared, his presence generated a particular tension. His calm was not the product of polished acting technique. It was the stillness of a man who had witnessed death on such a scale that Hollywood intrigues seemed trivial. Directors observed that Audie did not need to play a dangerous gunslinger. He was the most dangerous man in any room, even unarmed. Violence for him was reflexive. If conflict erupted on set or someone displayed disrespect, Murphy did not engage in shouting matches. He simply fixed his gaze on the offender, and that was enough to send a chill through even the most arrogant star. He despised the falseness and decorative heroics of war films, refusing to strike theatrical poses. His silence was the silence of a hunter, his stare the assessment of a man accustomed to viewing every stranger as a potential target. That inner darkness lent his noir westerns a terrifying authenticity. When his characters pulled the trigger, audiences sensed that this was a man who knew the true smell of gunpowder and blood. Despite outward success, Murphy's life slid steadily downhill. He struggled with a gambling addiction, losing vast sums at the racetrack. He attempted to numb his anguish with pills and constantly chased the adrenaline that peacetime could not provide. By the end of his life, his finances were in ruins and his mental health shattered. Murphy was among the first public figures of his era to speak openly about the struggles of veterans, urging the government to acknowledge those who had returned from war broken. His death in a plane crash in 1971 felt tragically inevitable, the final chapter of a man who had never truly come home from the front. Hollywood remembered him as a hero, but to himself he remained an eternal sentry, condemned to guard the perimeter of his own tormented conscience. Audie Murphy was an icon forged from pain and lead, a man who carried an entire cemetery within him, whose toughness was not an actor's gift, but an incurable scar etched into his very soul.
Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson was not simply an actor who portrayed hardened Avengers. He seemed carved from the same unforgiving landscape his characters inhabited. His presence carried the weight of lived experience, shaped in coal mines and tempered by war. Unlike many contemporaries who cultivated an image of toughness, Bronson never appeared to be proving anything. His weathered face, etched like stone, and his broad, work-worn hands told their own story. Born Charles Buczynski to Lithuanian immigrant parents in a struggling mining town in Pennsylvania, he was the 11th of 15 children. Poverty defined his childhood. Family stories recall that on one occasion he went to school wearing his sister's dress because there were no other clothes available. By the age of 10, he was already descending into the mines, working long hours in narrow, damp shafts for meager pay. Life underground, in constant danger of collapse and injury, stripped away any illusions about comfort or fairness. When his father died, young Charles helped support the family, learning early that survival depended on endurance, restraint, and quiet resolve. The toughness audiences later associated with him was not an invention, it was a shield forged in hardship. World War II offered Bronson a way out of the mines. He enlisted in the U.S. Air Forces and trained as a tail gunner on B-29 bombers, one of the most exposed and dangerous positions in the aircraft. Flying missions over the Pacific, he faced the constant risk that any sortie might be his last. He completed 25 missions and was wounded in action, later receiving the Purple Heart, a decoration he rarely mentioned, regarding his service as a duty rather than a badge of pride. When he returned home, he carried with him the quiet efficiency of a soldier and an unspoken awareness of how fragile life could be. Hollywood was not a dreamland to him. It was work,
steady employment, another shift, simply better lit than a mine shaft. He kept his distance from industry parties and intellectual debates about art, preferring solitude or time with his family. To many colleagues, he remained an enigma, self-contained and difficult to read. In the 1970s, following the release of Death Wish, Bronson became closely associated with stories of vigilantism, the lone individual confronting crime head-on. The role resonated strongly with audiences and stirred debate about social anxieties of the era. Some critics argued that the film reflected social anxieties of the era. Others worried about its implications. There were reports that the production drew unwanted attention from criminal figures who disliked the portrayal of street justice. When advised to take extra security precautions, Bronson reportedly dismissed the idea with characteristic understatement. Having survived war and years of grueling labor, he was not easily intimidated. On set, he moved with economy and focus. He valued discipline and efficiency, often performing his own physical scenes when possible. There was little theatrical flourish in his approach, only concentration and control. For Bronson, filmmaking was not about glamour, but about commitment to the task at hand. If a scene required intensity, he delivered it with conviction, grounded in the resilience that had defined his life. Bronson never fully blended into Hollywood's social fabric, nor did he seem to desire it. Fame did not appear to soften or transform him. He remained guided by principles forged long before studio lights found him: loyalty to family, self-reliance, and quiet strength. In the end, Charles Bronson's legacy rests not only on the roles he played, but on the unmistakable authenticity he brought to them, the sense that behind the camera stood a man who understood hardship, carried it without complaint, and let his silence speak louder than words.
History often frames Marilyn Monroe as a fragile casualty of fame, a naive blonde crushed beneath the machinery of celebrity. Yet the reality of her life was darker, more perilous. She did not merely move through Hollywood's highest circles. She was, according to persistent allegations, a strategic project, shaped and monitored by powerful figures who understood the film industry as both spectacle and leverage. Long before the world knew the name Marilyn, Johnny Roselli, a well-known Hollywood fixer with documented ties to organized crime, noticed the young Norma Jean when she was still an unknown model. For criminal networks of the era, Hollywood was not only a dream factory, but a convenient arena for influence, money, and access. In Monroe, Roselli is said to have recognized extraordinary potential, a woman whose presence could disarm men in positions of immense authority. Through backroom maneuvering, pressure, and the ruthless politics of studio-era casting, her ascent unfolded within a system that often left little room for independence. Her purported connections to underworld figures were not casual rumors, but part of a broader web of relationships that entangled entertainers, businessmen, and politicians. She moved in circles that overlapped with members of the so-called Chicago outfit, including Sam Giancana, one of the most powerful crime bosses of the time. To men like Giancana, proximity to celebrity offered access to influence, to secrets, to opportunity. Her association with members of the Kennedy family placed her at the intersection of politics, celebrity, and suspicion. At private gatherings, including events linked to Frank Sinatra's Cal Neva Lodge at Lake Tahoe, entertainers, power brokers, and controversial figures mingled freely. The atmosphere was intoxicating, glamorous, and charged with hidden agendas. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, maintained files on Monroe, as it did on many public figures connected to politically sensitive networks. Surveillance and speculation surrounded her, turning her life into a kind of glass enclosure in which privacy barely existed. The final chapter of Marilyn Monroe's life remains clouded by decades of conjecture. On August 5, 1962, she was found dead in her Brentwood home, the official cause ruled a probable suicide by barbiturate overdose. Yet theories flourished almost immediately. Some claimed she had become unstable and threatened to expose intimate details of her relationships with powerful men. Others insisted she had simply become too unpredictable, too vulnerable, too risky to those who feared scandal. There are accounts suggesting that in the days before her death, she had been emotionally distraught, speaking recklessly about what she knew. There are also stories, impossible to verify, of missing notebooks, of conversations erased, of people arriving at her home before authorities secured the scene. For some, these fragments form a pattern. For others, they are the inevitable myths that gather around a fallen icon. What is undeniable is that Monroe's death served many interests. For political figures wary of scandal, it closed a dangerous chapter. For law enforcement agencies concerned with national security, it ended a potential vulnerability. For those in the shadows of organized crime, it silenced a woman who had moved too freely between worlds that were never meant to overlap. Monroe did not die merely as a tragic movie star. She died carrying the weight of secrets, whether personal, political, or imagined by a public hungry for conspiracy. Her life marked a moment when Hollywood glamour, political ambition, and criminal intrigue blurred into a single glittering mirage. In the end, she became a symbol of that convergence, proof that even the brightest star may cast a shadow shaped by forces far beyond the camera's frame. If there was an omerta, a code of silence, it was not spoken in courtrooms, but enforced by fear, reputation, and power. And in the stillness of the morgue, her silence became permanent, leaving behind a legend forever suspended between myth and truth.
Before your eyes has unfolded the chronicle of 10 lives that reshaped what we thought lay behind the dazzling glow of Hollywood's golden age. We have seen that behind every flawless smile, every resolute jawline, every magnetic gaze stood a harsher reality, one forged in coal mines, on the battlefields of world wars, or in the shadowed offices of powerful men. These icons were not merely performers, they were products of a system that rewarded toughness and demanded resilience from anyone who hoped to survive an industry as ruthless as it was glamorous. Frank Sinatra and George Raft revealed how influence in Hollywood often depended on the company one kept, while Lawrence Tierney and James Cagney demonstrated that the violence they portrayed on screen carried an intensity drawn from personal experience. We saw how war heroes like Audie Murphy and Charles Bronson brought a trace of real battlefield gravity into studio backlots, and how the lives of figures such as Marilyn Monroe could become entangled in pressures far greater than fame itself. What unites these stories is a single truth. In classic Hollywood, the boundary between image and reality was far thinner than audiences imagined. The dream factory projected elegance and fantasy, yet behind the scenes it was sustained by ambition, compromise, and the relentless will of those determined to endure. When we revisit their films today, we see more than characters moving across the screen. We glimpse reflections of men and women who had known both hardship and triumph, who carried private battles beneath public brilliance. They left behind extraordinary art, and a sobering reminder that immortality on screen often demands a price few fully understand. Remember, when the lights dim and the credits begin to roll, the real story rarely ends there, and it is almost never a fairy tale.